Good evening. David and I were trying to decide who was going to go first, so we decided we'd save the best for last. So he's going to wrap this up for us tonight. I usually prefer, when talking to people, to do one thing. And my one goal is to get you to think. That's all I want you to do. Jog your mind, ponder it, roll it around, disagree with me. It doesn't really matter. But what I want you to do is at least to have considered and pondered whatever it is that we've discussed. That's always my goal. And so tonight what I want to do is walk you through one of my personal transitions in my faith. Not asking you to believe exactly what I'm going to show you. Not asking you to read it or see exactly how I read it and see it and how I'm going to practice it. But what I want you to do tonight is just take a moment, think about it, ponder it, roll it around your head. That's all I'm asking. If you are friends with me on Facebook or have had social discussions with me, some of this might not come as a surprise to you. But I'm very open about how I believe and how I think, and I want to share that with my brothers and sisters. So that's what this is tonight. So I want to talk to you about Jesus and nonviolence. My path from violence to Jesus. No, I don't have a record. No, I'm not a violent offender. But I do want to talk to you about my past. My past on this was, violence was good. Violence was, in many cases, to be praised. There were instances where I was asked, if somebody broke into your home, what do you do? And my answer was, shoot them and don't worry about it. I had collections of weapons and stuff that I've used as self-defensive means. And I thought I needed to have them with me always to be able to defend myself with violence. So that's where I started. That's where I came from. There were a couple of turning points that caused me to be challenged and to think. If you challenge me, I'm going to stop and I do what I ask you to do. I'm going to roll it around in my head. I'm going to ponder it. And I'm going to think about what you said, about what we talked about. 2 turning points. And I'm going to credit my mother-in-law for one of them. Don't ever tell her that I'm crediting her with anything, please. Because it could be a big deal. But the first turning point was, I remember we were talking about, I think this was at our house in Katy. She was sitting on the couch and we were talking about, if you're attacked, what do you do? And she said, whatever, I'm not going to do anything. They can kill me, I don't care. Again, remember my past. I said, what? You're just going to let them kill you? That's preposterous. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. Why would you do such a thing? The second turning point was, and this is more recent, Scott and I were talking about some social issues and the use of violence in social issues. And at the time, I thought it was okay. And Scott said, no, I really think you should think about it. I don't think violence I don't think it's supposed to be used. I don't think you should do it that way. I think you're thinking wrong. So I thought about it and I rolled it around in my head. And 3 years later, I'm standing here. So the couple of things that I always do when I'm rolling stuff around in my head is always first, what does Jesus say? Because if Jesus doesn't say it, well, then I'm not going to believe it. So that's the first step. So that's the first thing we're going to look at. The second step is, what does other scriptures in the Bible say? Do they corroborate what Jesus says? Do they clarify what Jesus says? How does that work? Third, what do other Christians say that have thought about the topic? What are their quotes? What do they say? Old, new, modern? What do they say? What's the general consensus of what they've come to? And then with anything that's a problem, there needs to be a resolution. So we're going to talk about my problem of violence and my transition to nonviolence and how that works out and what you should do, or at least what I believe I will do, put in those instances. So each of these next sections, there's just some text and some quotes. We're going to read through them, comment on them very quickly, and because I want the kind of words in the context of the scriptures that Jesus says, of some of the quotes we're going to see, to just kind of resonate in your mind. Matthew 5:38 and 39, you have heard that the law says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. Resist here in the Greek language, Greek or Hebrew, actually means not resisting with force. That is not resisting back with violence. Matthew 5, 43 through 46. You have heard that it was said to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Remember here where it says, hate your enemy? We're going to see it a little bit later on. Matthew 10:28, Jesus continues, don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They cannot touch your soul. Fear only God, who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Most of the violent reactions are based on fear, fearing your attacker. Matthew 16:25, if you try to hang onto your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. This was actually one of the key verses in the path and the journey that I've taken here, because I realized I was trying to hang on to my life via my means, and that Jesus says I was on a path that was going to lose it. Luke 6:35 is actually one that's meaning more and more to me as I read it down my path and my journey of my faith. Jesus says, love your enemies, do good to them, lend to them without expecting to be repaid. Then your reward from heaven will be very great, and you will be truly acting as children of the Most High. For he is kind to those who are unthankful and wicked. This was interesting to me because loving your enemies and doing good to them, opposite of violence, is how you will truly be acting as the children of the Most High. I think that's what God's calling me to. Love your enemies and do good to them. Well, what have others said? So we looked at what Jesus said. We got a good, clear picture of what Jesus said. What have others said? Well, in Romans 12, we're told, bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you're honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Instead, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them a drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals of shame on their heads. Don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. So here we have the Apostle Paul corroborating what Jesus has said and told us. So we do see that this theme carries throughout the Bible. In fact, Paul takes it a little bit different here. He says, conquer evil by doing good. You don't conquer evil by doing more evil. You conquer evil by doing good. Well, what about other people? What about some modern Christians? What about some older Christians? What about some popular Christians? What have they thought on this subject? Walter Wink says, in the final analysis then, love of enemies is trusting God for the miracle of divine forgiveness. If God can forgive, redeem, and transform me, I must also believe that God can work such wonders with anyone. Love of enemies is seeing one's oppressors through the prism of the reign of God, not only as they now are, but also as they become transformed by the power of God. Later he says, Jesus did not advocate nonviolence merely as a technique for outwitting the enemy, but as a just means of opposing the enemy, in such a way as to hold open the possibility of the enemies becoming just as well. Both sides must win. We are summoned to pray for our enemies' transformation and to respond to ill treatment with a love that not only is godly, but also, I am convinced, can only be found in God. You see, that's what the world wants to do, is say, as I did, you have to defend yourself with your means, and you need to use force. But really, if we're loving our enemies, we're not seeking to use those means. We're actually seeking to love them. Tertullian, an older Christian in the 100s AD, said the Christian does no harm even to his foe. Preston Sprinkle writes this little excerpt. We love our enemies, do good to those who hate us, bless those who curse us, extend kindness to the ungrateful, and flood evil people with mercy, not because such behavior will always work at confronting injustice, but because such behavior showcases God's delight in undelightful people. Faithfulness rather than perceived effectiveness motivates our response to evil. This was one of the stances I used to take. Well, if we don't do something, then they'll get away with it. Such behavior will not always work at confronting injustice. Sometimes being nonviolent does get you killed. We can look throughout scriptures. We can see Jesus. We can see the apostles. We can see Stephen. We have a whole host of examples that didn't use violence in return. Martin Luther King Jr., remember I told you earlier that scripture, remember, don't hate your enemy, it's going to come up. Nonviolence means avoiding not only external physical violence, but also violence of internal violence of spirit. You not only refuse to shoot a man, but you refuse to hate him. Refuse to hate him. Boy, doesn't that sometimes take a lot of work on our hearts when we see stories in the news or read of violence, and we instantly want to become angry. We're supposed to love our enemies. We refuse to hate them. Okay, but what about? So this is where I got to at this point in my journey. But what about the time? So I want to address those two. There's two of those that come up, and they're from Jesus. The first is in John 2:15. Jesus made a whip from some robes and chased them out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle. But do you see, Jesus hit people with a whip. Well, hold on a second. He chased them out of the temple. Never says he used violence against them. Never says he hit them. Never says he struck them with the whip. I think sometimes when I see the whip, I picture Jesus as Indiana Jones. Whoosh! You know? It's not like that. He chased them out of the temple. It doesn't say that he hit anybody. The second is the bigger of the two, because this one's pretty it was easy for me, rather, is in Luke 22:36-38. But now he said, take your money and a traveler's bag, and if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. I usually got to there and said, that's it? Jesus said, buy a sword. He wants you to have a sword. Everybody get armed. Jesus said, be armed to the teeth. Well, he actually didn't, because I overlooked the following verses in this passage. For the time has come for this prophecy to be fulfilled. Jesus wasn't asking them to be armed to the teeth. He wasn't asking them to overthrow and kill anybody. He was doing this so that the prophecy would be fulfilled. That he was counted among the rebels. Yes, everything written about me, the prophets, will come true. Look, Lord, they replied, we have 2 swords. Jesus said, that's enough. That's enough to fulfill the prophecy. You know, one of my brothers said, he still told them to take 2 swords. They still had 2 swords. They had swords. 12 guys and 2 swords. If you ask anybody about how many guns they have, usually it's multiple. How are 12 guys going to defend themselves with 2 swords? It's not going to happen. It was about fulfilling the prophecy. So how should we defend ourselves? So now we've talked about it. We've looked through what Jesus said. We've looked through what others in the Bible said. We looked through what other Christians have said. So what should we do? Because, hey, any of us can be attacked, right? Well, interestingly enough, most of the verses we looked at provide resolutions for what we're supposed to do. How can we can defend ourselves from Jesus, from how Jesus defended himself? First, remember that whip that he chased people off? You can chase people off. The favorite saying from the movie is, get off my lawn, from Clint Eastwood. You can chase people off. You can flee. In Matthew 6:27-28, Jesus says, when you're persecuted in one town, flee to the next. You don't have to sit there and be a punching bag. He's never asked a Christian to sit there and be a punching bag. You can flee. You can hide. In John 8:59, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself. You're more than welcome to hide. And in Matthew 6:27 and 28 that we read earlier, he hits multiple. You can love them, you can do good to them, you can bless them, and you can pray for them. These are the resolutions that Jesus tells us when we're being attacked that we can take. But this isn't the complete list. There's one more. And this one didn't hit me in my journey in studies till about 5 months ago. And the last means of self-defense that you can take is you can sacrifice yourself. In Romans 5:9, since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. You see, Jesus didn't shoot at God. He didn't try to stab him with a sword when his wrath was going to be expelled on us. He merely sacrificed himself. And we can do that as well as Christians. Many times we see stories in the news from usually a tornado or a hurricane, or sometimes maybe it's an unfortunate shooting that shouldn't have happened. But it'll be so-and-so died, but they died using their body as a shield for their loved one. You'll see it in news stories from tornadoes, where there was one I read where the lady's 15-year-old daughter was found beneath her from a house collapse. She was on top of her in the bathtub, and she died saving her child. You can sacrifice yourself. And really, I believe, and what I've come to, is that that's what Jesus calls of me, and what I think he might